What's going on, guys? MacDowan here. Let's talk about mid-level investment in the Righteous Fire character. If you've been following along, you should be able to get the character up and running about 20x and farm tier 16 maps. So what happens if you farm up about 35x in a day and a half, then blow everything on the character? I'm going to tell you about all of that, as well as some tricks about how I do map sustain and use the Sentinels to my advantage. So if that interests you, hit that like and subscribe button and let's go. Okay, I'm going to throw some map footage in the background. And here you can see how I use the Sentinels. I pop the Stalker one first. I'm just running through mobs, no RF. And then I'll use the Pandemonium ones to juice up some large packs of mobs. If you can kite them together, that works great. And then I'll just turn the RF on here and blow them all up. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. That's the way I do it. If you have other ideas, test them out. It's kind of difficult to get the mobs to do what you want them to do while you have your RF on, particularly if your AoE is as big as mine. But, you know, your mileage may vary. Now, in terms of map sustain, I have found that with singular focus, I tend to sustain about 1 to 1.5 on average. So if I start with 20 maps, I'm going to end up with 30 when I'm done. And that's great, but you're giving up quite a bit for that privilege, and I don't really care to sell maps. If you want to sell maps, I would say use singular focus. I'm getting about 1 to 1, give or take, without that node, and so I don't feel like it's really needed for solo, and you can always just throw it on, use it for a while, and then take it off. Just a couple other housekeeping things before we talk about the mid-level investment stuff. The Impossible Escape Conduit variant that I mentioned last time, I noticed has at least doubled, but in some cases tripled or quadrupled in price. And it is pretty good. I find that the life gain on kill saves me pretty often, and the charge generation can't be overstated. That's really smooth and nice when I'm mapping. I don't know if I would say it's worth 4x or 6, and I certainly don't think it's worth 10. Also, keep in mind the price on the Chaos Inoculation variant has come down significantly, and I don't know that I would make the argument that the one that I chose is the best one by any means. And so shop around. Maybe you can find one that is still cheap that allows you to do something interesting and creative with the build. So why would you want to go mid-level investment? I would say there's a few reasons. It's obvious that if you want to do more demanding content, you're going to need to invest more in the character. For me, that's not a big deal because I'm already farming the content that I want to farm. There is the benefit of, with additional investment comes the opportunity to fit things into the build for smoothness and fun. So, for example, larger AoE, extra defensive layers for tanking stuffs, things like that. And I find that those things are often more than worth the additional investment. It also allows you to experiment with new things, like, for example, buying a Chaos Inoculation, Impossible Escape, and changing the build around to make it more personalized to your playstyle. And I think the most important thing is you can use strategic mid-level investment into a character to launch yourself into either acquiring a specific item, farming for a Mage Blood, something like that, or quickly acquiring a boatload of currency to roll into a new character. And given that we're 2.5 weeks into the league, I think a lot of people are at the precipice of either rolling a new character or plunging into the waters of spending 5, 10, 15 exalt per piece of gear going forward. I do want to point out, a lot of people had mentioned to me that the items that I showcased last time were actually expensive in their view. And I had sort of pegged a 20x as a fair budget number, given that in previous leagues I happily spent 20x on a single jewel in week 1. However, as a lot of people have pointed out, that might not be a reasonable expectation that in a week or two that a player might have 20x. And if that's the case, let me know if what you guys want to see is me talking about ways that I acquire my first 5x or 10x or whatever. I can make that content. I had just thought that that was sort of a solved element of the game. And so another thing to point out here is I can clear tier 16 Delirium maps without turning my Righteous Fire on, indeed taking the gem out, as well as the Fired Trap gem. You can blow up the mobs with this setup just by shield charging through them. And it takes a little bit longer, but the stuff that's going to drop out of these maps is worth it even if you are slowed down to some degree. And so if you get to a point where you're dying too often or whatever, there are ways that you can get around it. So I want to talk a little bit about how I view character development and the way that I think about scaling. A good rule is what works for someone else is not necessarily going to work for you. And that includes the amount of damage that you do, the amount of defenses that you have. These aren't just hard and fast rules that you need to have this amount of damage or you can't defeat this boss. You need to have this much effective HP or you'll always die on this encounter. The game is not quite that black and white. And so I often find that I'm able to enjoy the game more when I focus a little bit more on tailoring the character to the specific content that I want to farm, as opposed to assigning an arbitrary number and then tailoring my expectations around that number. And I think another thing is that you should not be afraid to experiment. It's almost never happened that if I have a handful of exalts and I spend them on a new item that I regret it. Occasionally I get something and I'm like, well, this is more of a side grade. But most of the time you're able to sell something off, especially if you almost immediately don't want it. You're able to sell it off for most of what you spent. And the frequency with which you will buy an item that you're like, I want to try this. It's not exactly what was in the build guide, etc., but it looks fun. Do it. And you'll find that more often than not, especially since you know what you've done, you know what's changed. If the item that you've picked adds a stat that was not mentioned in the guide, so on and so forth, you know that, and so you can play around it, and so it might work for you. And so I'd encourage you to experiment with the build. I've derived a lot of joy in the game from doing that. Another point is sort of corollary to this, but the DPS number isn't the metric that I use to value my characters. The things that I'm often thinking about are how effective does the build complete the content I spend most of my time on, or how smooth does the character feel to play in terms of the movement skills that I have available, the actual movement speed of the character, the flexibility of the gem slots. Do I have room for experimenting with a Divine Blessing, as I did this time? Or is there room to fit in a Cast on Death portal if I need it? Something like that. And I think that POB number chasing is the wrong way to figure out if upgrades are right for you, because the only thing that software is going to tell you is the data, the numbers. And that has a good purpose, and it's a useful tool, but it's not the only tool that's available to you. You should also be considering your experience as you run the maps, and you should be considering your specific goals for the character. It doesn't make an awful lot of sense to spend 100x upgrading your character so you can slaughter the new Uber content if you never plan on doing it, or if you're only going to do it once. What's the point of that? Just tailor the character so that it's exactly what you want for the content that you're doing. If you're like me and you spend almost all your time in maps and you don't tend to do super omega juicing, and you find that you're not dying very often, you don't need to spend 50x on an upgrade that gives you 100 more health points. Maybe get something that has movement speed instead. look at the items that you already have equipped and see, are there ones that are double corrupted that have interesting things on them that I could leverage to my advantage that haven't been mentioned in the guides that I've watched, so on and so forth. And so that's my philosophy for how I look at the character. And as we talked about a minute ago, you know what sort of my analysis is for what the benefits are of going mid-level investment. And so, real quick here, let's talk about a few of the items that I purchased and then maybe some other mid-level investment options that you could look into if you want to advance the character further. Now that I've done this a few times, a few leagues in a row, it does seem like there's a predictable lifespan of a character, and it makes sense to break that down into phases. So, if the first phase was the league start, which we went over in the last guide video, that I think is characterized by spending most of the currency that I have as I get it on cheap items that merely make the build function for the content that I want to farm. And I'm less concerned about the smoothness of the experience and the speed of the experience. And the transition into the middle phase, the mid-level investment phase, I think is characterized by the willingness to spend the same amount of currency or even more than you spend on everything on your character on just a handful of items, maybe 3 to 5 important upgrades, which solidify the playstyle and allow the character to smoothly and quickly farm the content that you enjoy. And in order to get to that point with this character, my first move was to look into getting a different helmet. This is the one that I settled on, and you'll notice the top line there is supported by level 20 Immolate. And my understanding was that that particular support gem did not work with Fire Trap. However, when I socketed in this helm, it does appear to be supporting it, as indicated by the skill icons at the bottom of the screen. And the damage does seem to be scaled quite high, higher than I would have expected from a pseudo 5-link type setup, which you would have if you just pretended that line wasn't there. So take that for what you will. But the important thing is, I don't care about that line at all. It comes with the 19% increased ignite duration on enemies, which we do benefit from for sure. But it doesn't matter, because the reason we wanted this helm, or I wanted this helm in this case, is the concentrated effect line, the elemental damage line, the increased armor line, and the increased area damage line, as well as the open crafting slot, where we have the AoE gems, and the increased area of effect, which we can also change to maximum life depending upon the situation. And to give you some perspective, last league, about 5 or 6 days earlier than it would have, it is at this point, I purchased a similar helm for my character. I paid about 13 or 14x for it. I paid 5 for this one. Now, I don't know if it's cheaper because it doesn't have a native life roll, but I suspicion that it's because people are undervaluing this Immolate stat because they'd rather have concentrated effect and burning damage. I didn't actually want that. I want the option to use an awakened burning damage in the helm as well as in the chest piece with the Righteous Fire. And the reason that I'm not putting my Righteous Fire in the helmet is because I want to use awakened increased area of effect and the other 2 awakened gems as well, which give it an additional level. And I found this helmet that had the 24% increased area of effect enchant, and so I went for it. And I'm very happy that I did. Generally speaking, you would want the 40% increased Righteous Fire damage enchant. And that is definitely the traditional wisdom correct answer. But in my case, I found that since this is the second time I'm building the character and I'm approaching it a little bit different, I'm not using some of the items I was using before. I'm going for an explode setup instead of the more traditional Righteous Fire trap setup. And so it made sense to sort of follow my own advice and take a chance on this item. And I would also try to convey to you that maybe it's worth not only viewing the items that you buy in terms of their usefulness to you, but also their potential value as recombinator fodder in the future. And then the other and most expensive item that I purchased is this Watcher's Eye. And again, to give you some perspective, I bought literally an identical one last league for more than double what I paid this time, which was 18 or 19x. And the benefit of this item can't be overstated for the build. The chaos res is amazing. It makes it so that you can basically cap it with one roll on a piece of gear and your flask. And if you have a mage blood, you just all you need is the flask, and you don't need any chaos res on your gear, and you're good to go. And the 22% damage over time multiplier, while affected by malevolence, is indispensable. It's a huge damage increase. So I know I'm preaching to the choir that the Watcher's Eye is a great item, but for 18 to 20x, this is a steal. I was willing to pay much, much more than that for this exact item in the last week. And then the last thing that I did is, and I already mentioned this before, but I purchased the full host of Awakened gems. So Awakened Burning Damage, Swift Affliction, Elemental Focus. Once those are leveled up, those are going to be a big damage increase. And particularly the Awakened Increased Area of Effect is a big deal in terms of pushing you past the threshold that you need to sort of get the next big tick of AoE size on the Righteous Fire. So I'm looking forward to that. And then there are a few other things that I have not done yet that you could do that I think would make the character run even smoother. If you're willing to spend about 30x, I think that you could get a much bigger life chest than what I have on. Perhaps one that has crafted 10% of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield, but also the 7 or 8% increased max life and 6 or 7% increased max mana. I'm not 100% sure on the exact numbers there. But every time you can get something on the character that says plus X% max life, you just won. That's a big deal. If you can get it as an implicit, grab it. If you can get an extra roll on the chest, grab it. You could also try and get a chest that has everything I just mentioned plus what's already on there, and also an increased damage reduction roll. Another thing that you could do is go after a +2 scepter. I found some really decent ones, anywhere from 10x to 30x, depending on which mods are on it. That could also be a really big upgrade to the character's damage and smoothness of play. The third thing that I had thought of that may not be the right choice for everybody depending on your defenses, but you can get shields with +1 to all fire skills that are typically energy shield based, but you can get them on an armor base. They're just much more expensive. But again, if you're willing to spend 20, 30x on a piece, you can sort of get the stuff like that. But even at 10 to 15x, I saw some shields that were pretty interesting with that type of stuff on it. So ultimately, that's all I have to say really about the mid-level investment phase of the character. I think from here, I will pursue additional upgrades, but I don't know if I'm going to do the grind to purchase a mage blood or anything like that. So I don't know if I will go into the true high investment. But I have a couple ideas for things that will be certainly more expensive than any of the items we've talked about so far, but that I think might make the build pop off a little bit more in those maps that I'm doing, and maybe allow me to push it a little bit further than my normal comfort zone into the realm of juice. If you made it all the way to the end here, I really do appreciate it, and I will be back pretty soon, I think, with another video, maybe doing some crafting stuff. I'm starting to become interested in trying to manipulate the recombinators in a way that will allow me to make some interesting items for the build. And so if I'm able to do that, then I'll certainly share it with you guys. Otherwise, I will definitely be back with some more concrete, fleshed out Atlas strategies and, map farming strategies, stuff like that. Maybe some stuff about the numbers of drops that I'm getting. We might do some Cemetery versus Crimson Temple type comparison videos. Other than that, though, again, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. I appreciate you.